The most dangerous lies are never spoken by your enemies. They're whispered by the people you trust. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe truth is worth risking everything for, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, back to Naomi Carter. Naomi Carter steadied the crystal wine bottle with both hands as she approached the private dining room on the top floor of Hanseong Tower. Beyond the towering windows, Seoul shimmered beneath a blanket of rain, its endless sea of lights reflecting across the Han River like scattered diamonds. Inside, however, the atmosphere was colder than the storm outside. 12 men in tailored black suits sat around an ebony conference table polished to a mirror finish. Every movement was measured. Every silence carried weight. At the head of the table sat Ethan Kong. His charcoal suit fit with effortless precision, but it was not the fabric that commanded attention. A dark tattoo disappeared beneath the collar of his crisp white shirt before winding up the side of his neck, only hinting at the artwork hidden beneath tailored sleeves. His posture was perfectly still, his sharp amber eyes watching every face without appearing to move. He had built an empire by recognizing deception before others recognized danger. Tonight, however, danger had entered wearing an expensive smile. Naomi lowered her gaze as she reached the table. She had spent 8 months working evening shifts inside Ethan Kang's private restaurant, learning the invisible rules. Waitresses poured wine, replaced plates, and vanished. They did not interrupt conversations. They certainly did not speak during negotiations involving billions of dollars and rival organizations from across Asia. She carefully filled the crystal glasses one by one while voices drifted across the table in Korean. The translator stood beside Ethan with flawless confidence, repeating each sentence in English. Naomi's hands froze for the briefest fraction of a second. Her heartbeat stumbled. That wasn't what the man had said. She remained perfectly composed, continuing to pour the wine as though nothing had happened. Perhaps she had misunderstood. Perhaps exhaustion after another double shift had blurred her concentration. Then the elderly executive seated across the table spoke again, his tone respectful, almost ceremonial. The translator smiled politely. "He accepts your conditions," he announced. Naomi felt every hair on her arms stand upright. No, the executive had said the exact opposite. Not only had the translator changed the meaning, he had removed an entire sentence, one carrying a warning hidden behind traditional business etiquette, the kind that could only be understood by someone who knew far more than vocabulary alone. Across the table, Ethan reached calmly for the leather folder containing the final contract. A gold fountain pen rested beside it. The room grew impossibly quiet. One signature. That was all it would take. Naomi swallowed hard. She looked toward the translator. His expression remained perfectly relaxed. Too relaxed. For just an instant, his eyes shifted toward one of the foreign investors at the far end of the table. It was a tiny glance, gone almost before it appeared, but it carried the unmistakable confidence of a man who believed his performance would never be questioned. Naomi suddenly realized this was no mistake. Someone wanted Ethan Kong to sign a deal built on a lie. Every instinct screamed at her to remain silent. She was only a waitress. A black waitress surrounded by powerful men whose names filled newspapers, but whose faces never appeared in courtrooms. One careless interruption could end her career before sunrise. In a room like this, disappearing could mean far more than simply losing a job. Yet the memory of the elderly Korean professor who had taught her the language years ago echoed inside her mind. When people stop translating truth, he had once whispered, they begin translating power. Ethan uncapped the pen. The polished gold tip hovered above the contract. Naomi felt time collapsing around her. Before fear could silence her forever, she stepped closer, leaned toward the mafia boss, and spoke softly enough that only he could hear. "Sir." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Your translator is lying." The pen stopped in midair. Every sound inside the room vanished. 8 months earlier, Naomi Carter had arrived at Kong Hospitality wearing shoes with soles so thin they let the winter cold seep into her feet before sunrise. She carried everything she owned inside a faded canvas backpack and a folded recommendation letter from a small neighborhood cafe whose owner could no longer afford to keep the doors open. The towering glass building before her reflected the gray Seoul sky, like polished steel, making her feel even smaller than she already did. She had not come looking for opportunity. She had come looking for survival. The hostess glanced at Naomi's resume for less than 10 seconds before sliding it across the desk. Restaurant experience? For years. Korean? A little. It was the only lie Naomi allowed herself. Not because she wanted to deceive anyone, but because experience had taught her a painful lesson. The moment people discovered she spoke Korean fluently, questions followed. Why? Where did you learn? Who were you before this? Questions she had spent years avoiding. The manager hired her that same afternoon. The rules are simple, he explained while leading her through the marble corridors of the private restaurant reserved for executives, diplomats, and men whose names never appeared on reservation lists. Serve quietly. Smile politely. Never interrupt important guests. If Mr. Kong is dining, you become invisible. Invisible. Naomi almost smiled. She had been invisible for most of her life. The restaurant itself looked more like an art gallery than a place to eat. Dark walnut walls reflected warm amber lighting. Crystal chandeliers floated overhead like suspended stars. Every table was carved from black stone imported from Italy, while soft Korean instrumental music drifted almost unnoticed through hidden speakers. It was beautiful. It was also the quietest place Naomi had ever worked. Customers rarely laughed. Conversations stayed low. Security guards stood near every entrance without appearing to watch anyone, though Naomi quickly realized they watched everyone, especially Ethan Kong. She saw him for the first time on her third shift. He entered without announcement. Every employee instinctively straightened before anyone spoke his name. Tall, calm. A perfectly tailored black suit concealed a powerful frame shaped by discipline rather than vanity. Ink climbed above the collar of his white shirt before disappearing beneath his jawline, the tattoos continuing beneath fabric no one ever saw. Unlike other wealthy men, Ethan never demanded attention. He simply possessed it. Staff lowered their eyes as he walked past. Naomi did the same. She remembered only one thing about that evening. Not his expensive watch. Not the bodyguards. Not even the silence that followed him wherever he went. She remembered his habit of listening. While others spoke endlessly, Ethan watched. He noticed untouched glasses, nervous hands, delayed answers, the smallest hesitation. It reminded Naomi of someone she had known years ago, Professor Min Jae-hyun, an elderly Korean linguistics professor who had rented the upstairs apartment from Naomi's aunt in Chicago when she was 19. Living alone in a foreign country after losing his wife, the professor struggled with everyday English. Naomi had helped him with grocery shopping, doctor appointments, and paperwork. In return, he insisted on teaching her Korean. Not textbook Korean. Real Korean. The language hidden beneath words. Honorifics. Cultural nuance. Business etiquette. Expressions that meant one thing literally and something entirely different depending on tone, age, silence, or the social hierarchy inside the room. Translation. Professor Min often told her while pouring tea into tiny porcelain cups, is not replacing words. Translation is protecting truth. For 3 years, Naomi studied beside him every evening after work. She read newspapers aloud, practiced negotiations, watched old interviews, translated speeches until dawn. By the time Professor Min returned to Seoul, Naomi spoke Korean well enough that strangers often assumed she had lived there for years. Then life changed. Medical bills. Her aunt's illness. 2 jobs became 3. Dreams became rent. Languages became something she locked away because nobody paid a waitress to understand diplomacy. So she carried plates instead of books. She memorized table numbers instead of vocabulary. And day after day, inside Ethan Kang's restaurant, Naomi hid the one skill that could one day save a man's empire. She simply never imagined that day would arrive with a single sentence. Your translator is lying. No one moved. Ethan Kang's fountain pen remained suspended less than an inch above the final page of the contract, the polished gold nib catching the warm chandelier light. The silence inside the private dining room no longer felt elegant. It felt dangerous. Naomi instantly realized what she had done. Every rule she had spent 8 months obeying had just been shattered by 6 quiet words. Your translator is lying. The translator recovered first. A short laugh escaped his lips before he adjusted his silk tie with practiced composure. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, he said with a courteous smile. Mr. Kong, I believe your waitress has confused conversational Korean with executive business language. Several executives exchanged amused glances. One of the foreign investors leaned back in his chair, visibly entertained. Another reached for his whiskey as though the interruption were little more than dinner theater. Naomi felt every eye in the room settle upon her. Not as a person, as a servant who had forgotten her place. She lowered the wine bottle onto a silver tray before clasping her trembling hands together. Her pulse hammered against her ribs, but her face remained remarkably calm. She had expected anger. She had not expected everyone to smile. The translator's confidence grew stronger. With respect, sir, he continued, she's a waitress. Negotiations like these involve legal terminology, historical references, and diplomatic nuance. Fluency requires years of professional experience. He turned toward Naomi with a patient expression that carried unmistakable contempt. You should return to serving the tables. A few quiet chuckles spread across the room. Naomi looked toward the elderly Korean chairman seated opposite Ethan. The old man's expression had changed. His smile had disappeared. His eyes, sharp despite his age, rested on Naomi with unmistakable curiosity. He knew she had understood every word. Ethan Kong finally placed the pen back onto the table. Not signing, not speaking, simply watching. His amber eyes moved first toward the translator, then toward Naomi, then back again. The room seemed to shrink beneath that silent examination. Everyone in Seoul's underworld knew Ethan Kong possessed an unsettling gift. He rarely reacted immediately. He observed. He listened. He allowed lies to reveal themselves. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that nobody dared interrupt. What exactly? He folded his hands. Did he say? The translator answered before Naomi could breathe. He accepted our proposed distribution structure and thanked us for our generosity. Ethan did not even look at him. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Naomi. And you? Her throat tightened. This was the moment she could still retreat. She could apologize, claim she had misunderstood, walk away with nothing more than humiliation. But if she remained silent now, Professor Min's words would haunt her forever. Translation is protecting truth. Naomi lifted her head. He didn't thank you. Every syllable landed with absolute certainty. He warned you. Several executives frowned. The translator laughed again, louder this time. This is absurd. Naomi ignored him. He said. She continued in flawless Korean before switching effortlessly into English. A partnership built without equal honor becomes ownership disguised as friendship. The elderly chairman's eyes widened. Naomi continued before anyone could interrupt. Then he added something your translator deliberately omitted. She repeated the chairman's final sentence in Korean, matching not only the words but the respectful cadence, the deliberate pauses, and the subtle emphasis placed upon one particular honorific. When she translated it into English, the atmosphere inside the room transformed. If your advisor has translated my words differently, someone at this table is already negotiating against you. Silence. Complete. Absolute. The chairman slowly nodded. Once. The smallest movement imaginable. But it was enough. Every executive on the Korean side straightened in. Their seats. The translator's smile finally disappeared. A single bead of sweat rolled beneath his collar despite the cool air conditioning. For the first time that evening, Ethan Kong turned toward the man standing beside him. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He simply asked one question. In 3 languages. His tone calm enough to terrify everyone listening. Repeat exactly what Chairman Lee just said. The translator opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Across the polished ebony table, Naomi watched his confidence collapse one heartbeat at a time. And for the first time since entering the room, Ethan Kang's expression changed. Not into rage, into suspicion. The negotiation had just stopped being about billions of dollars. It had become a hunt for the truth. The translator blinked once, then twice. His lips parted, but the polished confidence that had carried him through the evening dissolved beneath Ethan Kang's unwavering gaze. He began. Nothing followed. The silence became unbearable. Chairman Lee slowly folded his hands atop the ebony table, saying nothing, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it deserved. Around him, the Korean executives exchanged restrained glances. None of them looked surprised anymore. Instead, they watched Ethan with quiet curiosity, waiting to see whether the man they had come to negotiate with possessed the wisdom to recognize betrayal inside his own circle. Ethan never looked away from the translator. "You've interpreted for me," he said calmly. "For almost 4 years." "Yes, sir." "You've attended confidential meetings." "Yes, sir." "You've negotiated international contracts worth billions." "Yes, sir." "And today?" His voice remained almost gentle. "You suddenly cannot repeat one sentence." The translator swallowed. The chairman spoke too quickly. Chairman Lee finally smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of an old man who had just watched someone choose the worst possible lie. "I am 74 years old," he said in flawless English. "No one has ever accused me of speaking too quickly." The room fell silent again. The translator's face visibly paled. Naomi remained, standing near the wine cart, trying to disappear despite becoming the center of every eye in the room. She could feel her heartbeat echoing inside her chest. Every instinct urged her to apologize and leave, but another instinct, the one Professor Min had patiently cultivated years ago, told her that truth required patience. Across the table, Ethan leaned back slightly. He still hadn't raised his voice. That frightened everyone far more than anger would have. He turned toward Naomi. "Come here." She hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. The polished marble floor seemed impossibly loud beneath her shoes. Every security guard watched her. Every executive watched her. Even the restaurant staff, standing quietly near the doorway, stared in disbelief. A waitress had just been summoned to stand beside the most powerful man in the room. Ethan slid the leather contract toward her. "Sit." Naomi's eyes widened. "Sir, I don't think that wasn't a suggestion." The chair beside him had never been offered to anyone outside his inner circle. Now it waited for a woman who had entered the room carrying nothing more dangerous than a bottle of wine. Naomi slowly took her seat. The translator stared at her as though she had stolen something that belonged to him. Ethan opened the contract. "Read Clause 12. The translator interrupted immediately. "Mr. Kong, with respect, legal interpretation requires certified. I wasn't speaking to you." His words landed like polished steel. The translator fell silent. Naomi carefully lifted the document. The legal English was flawless, precise, professional, but something else immediately caught her attention. She glanced toward the Korean version resting beside it. Her breathing slowed. "There are differences," she whispered. Chairman Lee nodded almost imperceptibly. Ethan noticed. "What differences?" Naomi compared both pages line by line. Her finger stopped halfway down the document. "This sentence," she looked up, "doesn't exist in Korean." Several executives leaned forward. Naomi continued reading. "The English version grants equal authority over future distribution." She turned another page. "The Korean version doesn't." Ethan's expression remained unreadable. "What does it say?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "It says that operational authority automatically transfers to the senior domestic partner if foreign representation is deemed culturally insufficient." One executive from Ethan's side frowned. "What does that even mean?" Naomi looked directly at Chairman Lee before translating the cultural implication instead of merely the words. "It means," she said quietly, "the moment this contract is signed, Mr. Kong stops being a partner." She closed the folder. "He becomes an employee inside his own business." No one breathed. Not because of the contract. Because every Korean executive across the table remained perfectly calm. None of them argued. None of them corrected her. Instead, Chairman Lee slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them carefully on the table. Then, for the first time that evening, he spoke directly to Ethan. "I wondered whether anyone beside me still understood the language of honor." His eyes shifted toward Naomi. "It appears your waitress does." Ethan looked at Naomi for a long moment. Not as staff, not as a stranger, but as someone whose value had been hidden in plain sight all along. Meanwhile, standing alone beside the wall, the translator finally understood that this negotiation was no longer deciding the future of a business deal. It was deciding the future of his own life. No one spoke for several long seconds. The silence was no longer awkward. It had become evidence. Ethan Kong slowly closed the contract and rested both hands on the polished ebony table. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain continued to streak across the Seoul skyline, turning the city lights into blurred ribbons of gold and white. Inside the room, however, every eye remained fixed on two people. A waitress, and a translator. Only one of them had told the truth. Chairman Lee broke the silence first. Miss Carter. Naomi immediately stood. Yes, Chairman. You said the English version failed to preserve the meaning. Yes, sir. I would like everyone here to hear what I actually intended to say. Naomi hesitated for a heartbeat. She glanced toward Ethan. He gave a single nod. Nothing more. It was permission. Naomi faced the room. When she spoke in Korean, her pronunciation was so natural that several executives instinctively turned toward Chairman Lee, momentarily forgetting which of the two had actually spoken. She repeated his original statement with perfect pacing, preserving every respectful pause and every subtle shift in tone. Then she translated. Chairman Lee thanks Mr. Kong for honoring Korean tradition by coming in person instead of sending representatives. She paused. However, respect between partners must always remain equal. If either side believes friendship allows hidden authority, then today's agreement should end before a single signature is placed on paper. She lifted her eyes. That wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. One executive frowned. Invitation? Naomi nodded. In Korean business culture, especially among older generations, direct confrontation is often avoided. She looked toward Chairman Lee before continuing. When he says the agreement should end if hidden authority exists, he isn't threatening to leave. He's giving Mr. Kong one final opportunity to discover whether someone near him is being dishonest. Chairman Lee smiled. A very rare opportunity. Several Korean executives quietly nodded in agreement. Across the table, Ethan's own advisors began exchanging uneasy glances. Naomi wasn't merely translating words anymore. She was translating intent. The difference changed everything. She reached for the Korean contract once more. There's something else. Every head lifted. She placed both versions side by side. Notice the repeated phrase. Her finger rested beneath 4 Korean characters. The translator consistently rendered this as exclusive operational authority. She slowly shook her head. That isn't correct. What does it mean? Ethan asked. It literally means temporary stewardship. One executive looked confused. Isn't that basically the same thing? No. Naomi's answer came instantly. Operational authority implies ownership. Temporary stewardship describes responsibility held on behalf of someone else. She looked around the table. One creates control. The other creates trust. She turned another page. The same manipulation appears 6 different times. Each occurrence shifted the legal balance just enough to favor one party without appearing obvious to anyone reading only the English version. No one interrupted. Even the translator remained silent. Naomi continued. He also removed every honorific Chairman Lee used when referring to Mr. Kong. One investor shrugged. Why does that matter? Chairman Lee answered himself. Because respect is language. His calm voice filled the room. When respect disappears from translation, suspicion replaces it. He looked directly at Ethan. If your interpreter had continued speaking for me, our families would have walked away believing you intended to dominate us. Ethan's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, not toward Chairman Lee, toward the man who had stood beside him for years. The translator finally found his voice. I can explain. Ethan raised one finger. The room fell silent again. You've had 4 years to explain. The translator's face drained of color. Naomi quietly stepped back from the table, believing her role had finally ended. Instead, Ethan surprised everyone. He picked up the Korean contract and slid it across the table toward her. Finish. She blinked. Sir. The negotiation. He leaned back in his chair. You understand both languages. You understand both cultures. And unlike everyone else in this room, his eyes briefly met hers. You've already proven you understand the value of the truth. For a moment, Naomi couldn't move. Hours earlier, she had entered the room carrying wine for men who barely noticed her existence. Now the most feared Korean Mafia boss in Seoul had asked a Black Waitress to speak on his behalf during the most important negotiation of the year. Around the table, disbelief settled over every face. Because at that exact moment, the least powerful person in the room had become the only voice everyone was willing to trust. Naomi drew a slow breath before opening the contract again. She no longer felt like a waitress standing in the wrong room. She felt exactly as Professor Min had taught her to feel whenever words carried consequences. Calm, precise, respectful. She looked first at Chairman Lee, then at Ethan Kong. With your permission, both men nodded. Naomi began translating each paragraph aloud, alternating naturally between Korean and English. Her voice never rushed. Every sentence carried the same careful rhythm Chairman Lee himself had used only moments earlier. She preserved every honorific, every deliberate pause, every layer of meaning hidden beneath formal business language. The atmosphere inside the room transformed. This was no longer a negotiation. It had become a lesson in trust. When Chairman Lee spoke about mutual prosperity, Naomi explained why he had chosen one particular Korean expression instead of another. He isn't promising profit, she said softly. He's promising responsibility. She turned another page. When he says, "We will carry this agreement together," he uses a phrase traditionally reserved for family businesses that survive multiple generations. One executive quietly whispered, "I never knew that." Naomi smiled politely. Most dictionaries don't. Chairman Lee's weathered face softened. For the first time that evening, genuine admiration appeared in his eyes. "Young lady," he said in Korean, "where did you learn our language?" Naomi answered in the same language. From a teacher who believed respect should always be translated before vocabulary. The old chairman closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they shimmered with emotion. "Professor Min Jae-hyun." Naomi froze. "Yes." A gentle smile spread across the chairman's face. "We studied together at Seoul National University more than 40 years ago." Later, Chairman Lee slowly rose from his chair. Every executive followed his example. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the elderly businessman bowed respectfully toward Naomi. Not deeply, but enough. Enough to communicate gratitude. Enough to leave every person in the room speechless. Naomi instinctively stood and returned the bow. "You honor my teacher," she whispered. "No," Chairman Lee replied gently. "You honor everything he tried to preserve." Across the table, Ethan watched the exchange without interrupting. His expression remained controlled, yet something behind his amber eyes had changed. Not surprise. Recognition. He realized he had spent 8 months walking past extraordinary character without ever asking her name. Before anyone could speak again, one of Chairman Lee's senior advisors quietly reached into his briefcase. "I believe," he said in Korean, "there is something Mr. Kong should see." He removed a sealed envelope bearing no company logo. Only a wax seal. Chairman Lee accepted it and placed it directly in front of Ethan. "This was never meant to be opened," he said calmly. "Unless we discovered dishonesty before the contract was signed." Ethan looked at the envelope. Then at Chairman Lee. "What is it?" "A contingency." The chairman's voice remained steady. If today's translator had proven trustworthy, this document would have been destroyed. He paused. But since Miss Carter uncovered the deception, he gently pushed the envelope closer. "You deserve to know how close you came to losing far more than a business partnership." Ethan broke the seal. Inside lay several photographs, bank transfer records, encrypted email printouts, and a single financial agreement signed months earlier. The translator's name appeared at the bottom, alongside the signature of Ethan Kang's largest rival organization. No one needed an explanation anymore. The betrayal had not begun tonight. It had been carefully planned for months. And without a black waitress brave enough to interrupt one sentence, the most dangerous man in Seoul would have willingly signed away the future of his own empire. The envelope remained open on the table. No one reached for the documents again. There was no need. The bank transfers, encrypted messages, and signed payment records had already spoken louder than any confession ever could. The translator stared at the photographs as though they belonged to someone else. His carefully constructed confidence had disappeared completely. Across the room, 2 of Ethan Kang's security officers quietly stepped forward. They never touched their weapons. They simply waited. Everyone understood what that meant. Ethan closed the folder with deliberate care. The soft sound echoed through the silent dining room. "How much?" His voice was almost conversational. The translator blinked. "Sir, how much did they pay you?" The man lowered his head. No answer came. Ethan asked again. "How much was 4 years of loyalty worth?" The translator's shoulders began to shake. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Chairman Lee quietly exhaled. Greed never believes it will be discovered. The translator finally looked up, his face drained of color. "They promised my family would be safe." The confession surprised everyone. "My brother owed money. They said if I changed only a few words. His voice broke. No one would ever notice. Ethan listened without interrupting. His expression revealed neither anger nor satisfaction, only disappointment. You underestimated language, he said quietly. And you underestimated the people willing to protect it. The translator slowly nodded. I know. One of the security officers stepped forward. Without resistance, the translator removed his identification badge and placed it on the table beside the contract. No shouting, no violence, no dramatic threats, only silence. As he was escorted toward the door, he paused beside Naomi. For several seconds, he simply looked at her. I thought no one would understand. Naomi met his eyes with calm compassion. I understood. She paused. I just wish you had remembered that truth is always translated eventually. The translator lowered his head. Then he disappeared behind the closing doors. The room remained motionless. Outside, the rain had stopped. Moonlight now reflected across the glass skyline, replacing the storm with quiet silver light. Chairman Lee slowly poured fresh tea into 2 porcelain cups. One he placed before Ethan, the other before Naomi. Several executives exchanged astonished glances. Tea was never served this way during negotiations. Not unless someone had become part of the conversation. Chairman Lee smiled gently. Please. Naomi hesitated. I am only a waitress. The elderly chairman chuckled softly. No. He looked directly at her. Tonight, you were the guardian of every honest word spoken in this room. The compliment left Naomi speechless. She carefully accepted the cup with both hands, following the exact etiquette Professor Min had taught her years before. Chairman Lee noticed immediately. So he truly taught you well. Across the table, Ethan observed every movement. Not the tea, not the conversation. Naomi, the respect she showed without performance. The confidence she carried without arrogance. The humility that remained untouched despite everything that had happened. Most people revealed their character after gaining power. Naomi revealed hers while everyone else was giving it to her. That interested him far more than her remarkable command of Korean. The negotiations resumed. This time there was no translator standing between the two sides. Naomi interpreted every sentence exactly as spoken. No embellishment, no omission, no manipulation. The discussion that had nearly collapsed less than an hour earlier now progressed with surprising ease. Questions were answered honestly. Concerns were addressed openly. Even disagreements sounded respectful. By the time the final document had been revised, both parties understood one another completely. Chairman Lee reached for his fountain pen. So, he smiled toward Ethan. Shall we sign the agreement we actually intended to make? Ethan looked at the corrected contract for only a moment before signing his name. Chairman Lee followed. The room filled with quiet applause. Not because billions of dollars had just changed hands, but because trust had returned to the table. As executives stood to exchange handshakes, Ethan remained seated. His gaze followed Naomi as she quietly gathered empty teacups, almost as though she intended to return to being invisible. He watched her for several long seconds. Then, before she reached the doorway, he spoke. Miss Carter. She turned. I don't believe you'll be carrying trays tomorrow. The room fell silent once again. Every executive understood exactly what those words meant. Naomi's life had just changed forever. The following morning, the restaurant looked exactly as it had the day before. The marble floors gleamed beneath warm morning light. Crystal glasses caught the first rays of sunrise. Servers hurried between tables preparing for another day of invisible work. Everything appeared unchanged. Only Naomi felt different. She tied her black apron with the same careful movements she had repeated hundreds of times before, silently hoping the previous night had somehow been a dream. Perhaps Mr. Kong had spoken emotionally. Perhaps he had forgotten. Perhaps she would simply return to carrying trays. The thought brought her unexpected comfort. She understood restaurants. She understood hard work. Power was something she had never wanted. At precisely 9 o'clock, the restaurant manager appeared in the dining room. He looked unusually nervous. Naomi. She looked up. Mr. Kong requests your presence. The surrounding staff immediately stopped working. Forks paused in midair. Coffee cups remained suspended above tables. Everyone remembered what had happened the night before. No one spoke. Naomi quietly removed her apron. Her hands remained steady. Her heart did not. She followed the manager through a private elevator that climbed silently toward the executive floor. When the doors opened, she found Ethan Kong standing alone beside a wall of glass overlooking Seoul. Morning sunlight illuminated the tattoo winding above his collar before disappearing beneath his tailored charcoal suit. He didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he continued watching the city. "Do you know," he said quietly, "how many people have lied to me because they believed I wanted comfort more than truth?" Naomi remained silent. "I don't know, sir." "Neither do I." He finally turned. "But I know how many interrupted me to protect me." His eyes met hers. One. The room fell quiet again. Ethan walked toward a long walnut conference table. Several folders rested neatly upon its polished surface. One of them contained Naomi's employment file. He opened it. Naomi Elizabeth Carter. He read slowly. Excellent employment history. No disciplinary reports. No criminal record. He paused. Languages spoken. His gaze lifted. "You left Korean off your application." Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." "Why?" She answered honestly. "Nobody hires waitresses because they understand international diplomacy." A faint smile touched the corner of Ethan's mouth. It disappeared almost immediately. "No, they usually don't." He closed the folder. "I had my investigators verify everything after last night's meeting." Naomi's expression remained calm. "I assumed you would." They also found Professor Min. That surprised her. He still lives outside Busan. He still speaks about the young woman who insisted every translation should preserve dignity before grammar. Naomi lowered her eyes. "He changed my life." "So I noticed." Ethan walked toward the window once more. "For years." He spoke almost to himself. "I've surrounded myself with specialists. Lawyers. Economists. Negotiators. Security experts." He slowly turned back. "And yesterday a waitress accomplished what none of them did." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Not for a weapon, for a simple business card. He placed it gently on the table between them. The black lettering caught the morning light. Director of International Cultural Strategy. Naomi stared at the card, then back at Ethan. "I don't understand." "You don't have to answer today." He folded his hands. "But beginning now, you no longer work in my restaurant. You work beside my executive team." Naomi looked almost overwhelmed. For strangers. Now she was being offered a seat in rooms she had never imagined entering. She thought of Professor Min, of her aunt, of every customer who had looked through her as though she were invisible. Then she gently pushed the business card back across the table. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You refuse." "No." Her voice was soft. "I accept." She smiled for the first time. "But only if someone else gets my waitress position." Ethan looked at her curiously. "Why?" "Because someone else deserves a chance to be seen." For the first time in many years, the feared Korean Mafia boss laughed. Not loudly, not for long, but genuinely. And in that quiet office overlooking Seoul, he realized the greatest investment he had ever made wasn't written inside a billion-dollar contract. It was standing across the table with dignity that no amount of money could ever buy. 3 months later, the story had become something no one inside Kong International could quite explain. The woman who once carried crystal wine glasses now carried briefing folders into executive meetings across Seoul, Tokyo, Singapore, and New York. Yet almost nothing about Naomi Carter herself had changed. She still arrived before sunrise. She still greeted every receptionist by name. She still thanked the cleaning staff before entering the boardroom. And every afternoon, no matter how busy the schedule became, she quietly shared lunch with the restaurant employees she had once worked beside. Some habits, she believed, should never become casualties of success. One autumn afternoon, Ethan Kong stood alone outside the executive conference room, watching through the glass wall. Inside, Naomi was explaining subtle cultural differences to a room filled with international investors. No raised voice, no dramatic gestures, only patience, only clarity, only respect. People listened, not because she demanded authority, because she earned it. One of Ethan's senior advisors approached quietly. "I've reviewed every negotiation since Miss Carter joined us." Ethan kept watching. "And our international disputes have dropped by almost 80%. Another pause. "Clients trust us more. They say we actually." "Listen." Ethan gave a faint nod. "Because we finally do." Later that evening, after the final meeting had ended, Chairman Lee returned unexpectedly to Ethan's office. The elderly businessman carried a small wooden box wrapped in traditional Korean silk. "I brought this for Miss Carter." Naomi looked surprised. I couldn't possibly. You can. Chairman Lee smiled warmly. It belonged to Professor Min. Naomi's breath caught. Inside rested an old fountain pen. Its lacquered body showed tiny signs of wear from decades of use. Folded beneath it was a handwritten note. Professor Min's elegant Korean calligraphy had faded slightly with time. Naomi translated the words aloud. Language is not given to us, so we may sound intelligent. She paused, her voice trembling ever so slightly. It is given so another human being may feel understood. Silence filled the office. Chairman Lee carefully closed the wooden box. He asked me years ago to give that pen to the student who finally understood that lesson. He smiled. I believe I found her. Naomi held the pen gently, as though afraid time itself might break beneath her fingertips. Across the room, Ethan watched quietly. He suddenly realized something that surprised even him. He could remember every expensive gift he had ever received. None of them carried the weight of that simple wooden box. As Chairman Lee prepared to leave, he stopped beside Ethan. You built an empire through strength. The old man looked toward Naomi. She will help you preserve it through wisdom. After the chairman departed, dusk settled across Seoul. The city lights slowly awakened beneath the evening sky. Naomi stood by the window, holding Professor Min's pen. I still don't feel like I belong here. Ethan walked beside her. When I was 23, he said quietly, I believe power meant being the smartest man in every room. He looked toward the skyline. I was wrong. Naomi glanced at him. What changed? He smiled faintly. A waitress corrected me. Both of them laughed softly. The sound disappeared into the quiet office. Far below, employees left the building, unaware that one ordinary decision to tell the truth had permanently changed the future of everyone working there. Months later, new employees would hear the story in whispers. Not because it involved a mafia boss. Not because billions of dollars had been saved. But because a black waitress had risked everything to protect a man who never asked for her help. And because that man had chosen humility over pride when the truth stood before him. Some people spend their entire lives searching for the right words. Others become unforgettable because they choose to speak the right ones at exactly the right moment. And on that rainy night in Seoul, when one courageous waitress quietly whispered, "Your translator is lying," an empire was saved, a teacher's legacy lived on, and everyone in that room was reminded that dignity never wears a job title. It simply waits for someone brave enough to recognize it. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.